The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual chaos. Nurses rushed between beds, doctors shouted orders, and the constant beeping of machines filled the air. Sarah Chen had been working for 12 hours straight, her scrubs stained with coffee and exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. "Another accident victim coming in," called out Nurse Martinez from the reception desk. "ETA 5 minutes." Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and grabbed a fresh pair of gloves. It was nearly midnight, and the hospital had already seen 3 car crashes, 2 heart attacks, and a kitchen fire victim. She wondered what this night would bring next. The automatic doors burst open with a loud whoosh, but what entered wasn't the usual paramedic team. Instead, 2 men in elaborate uniforms stepped through, their gold buttons gleaming under the harsh hospital lights. Their red jackets were decorated with intricate embroidery, and tall black hats sat perfectly on their heads despite the urgency of the situation. "What in the world?" muttered Dr. Martinez, the head of emergency, as he stopped mid-conversation with a colleague. Between the 2 uniformed men, they carried a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Her long dark hair was matted with blood, and her pale blue dress was torn and dirty. The girl's face was ghostly white, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. "We need help immediately," the taller guard announced in a crisp British accent. His voice carried authority that made every person in the emergency room turn and stare. Sarah stepped forward, her medical training overriding her confusion about the unusual arrival. "Bring her to bed 7, she instructed, pointing to an empty gurney. "What happened to her?" The shorter guard, whose mustache was perfectly groomed despite the emergency, spoke carefully. "There was an incident at the palace grounds. She fell from a considerable height." "Palace grounds?" Dr. Martinez raised his eyebrows. "What palace? This is downtown Chicago." The 2 guards exchanged a quick glance, and Sarah noticed something odd. The taller one's uniform had a crest she didn't recognize, with symbols that looked ancient and foreign. The shorter guard's boots were polished to a mirror shine, not a speck of dirt on them despite supposedly rushing from some outdoor emergency. "We cannot discuss details," the tall guard said firmly, "but the young lady requires immediate medical attention. She is important." Sarah helped transfer the girl to the hospital bed. As she began her examination, she noticed something strange. The girl's dress, though torn and bloodied, was made of the finest silk she had ever seen. The fabric felt expensive, almost royal in quality. Around her neck hung a delicate silver necklace with a pendant that sparkled even under the fluorescent lights. "What's her name?" Sarah asked while checking the girl's pulse. It was weak but steady. "Lady Elizabeth," the shorter guard answered quickly. "Lady Elizabeth Thornfield." Dr. Martinez frowned. "I need to see some identification, insurance cards, emergency contacts." The guards looked uncomfortable. We don't have such documents with us," the tall one admitted. This was an emergency evacuation. Sarah continued her examination, noting a large bump on the girl's head and what appeared to be a broken wrist. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with this whole situation. The girl's injuries were consistent with a fall, but there were other marks on her arms that looked older, like small bruises that had been healing for days. "Has she been injured before recently?" Sarah asked, pointing to the fading bruises. The guards exchanged another look. "Lady Elizabeth is accident-prone," the shorter one said unconvincingly. Meanwhile, the girl began to stir slightly. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small moaning sound. Sarah leaned closer to hear if she would say anything. Where am I?" the girl whispered, her voice weak and confused. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's eyes opened wider, and she looked around frantically. When she saw the 2 guards standing nearby, fear flashed across her face. "No," she whispered urgently, grabbing Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me back. Please." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the guards, who were now standing stiffly, their faces unreadable. "Take you back where?" she asked the girl softly. But before the girl could answer, the tall guard stepped forward. "She's confused from the head injury," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "She doesn't know what she's saying." The girl's grip on Sarah's arm tightened. "I'm not confused," she whispered desperately. "My name isn't Elizabeth. It's Emma Rodriguez." And these men, they're not guards. They took me. Sarah's heart began racing. She looked at the two men in their elaborate uniforms, noticing now that despite their official appearance, something about them felt off. Their uniforms were too perfect, too theatrical, like costumes rather than real military dress. "I need to speak with my supervisor," Sarah announced, trying to keep her voice steady. "Continue monitoring her vitals," she told Nurse Martinez quietly, "and don't leave her alone with them." As Sarah walked toward Dr. Martinez's office, she heard the tall guard speak in a low, threatening voice to his companion. "We need to get her out of here quickly, before she says too much." Sarah's mind raced. If this girl was telling the truth, if she had really been taken against her will, then she was dealing with something much more serious than a simple accident. She needed to call security, maybe even the police. But she also needed to be careful. These men, whoever they really were, seemed dangerous. She reached for her phone to call hospital security. But as she did, she noticed the shorter guard watching her every move. His eyes were cold and calculating, nothing like the concerned expression he had worn when they first arrived. The girl, Emma, was still conscious and looking around the emergency room with wide, frightened eyes. She seemed to be taking in every detail, every person, as if trying to memorize faces of potential helpers. "Doctor," Emma called out weakly when she saw Sarah approaching. "Please don't let them take me. I don't know how long they've been keeping me, but this is the first time I've been around other people in weeks." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Kidnapping. That's what this was. And somehow, these criminals had been bold enough to bring their victim to a public hospital, probably thinking their fake uniforms and official demeanor would prevent anyone from asking too many questions. Sarah made a decision. She walked calmly to the nurse's station and picked up the red phone that connected directly to hospital security. But as she lifted the receiver, she felt a strong hand grip her shoulder. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, doctor," the tall guard said quietly behind her. His voice was no longer polite or respectful. It carried a clear threat. Sarah's blood turned cold as the tall man's grip tightened on her shoulder. She slowly turned around to face him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the emergency room could hear it. The man's eyes were no longer the concerned expression of someone seeking help for an injured person. Instead, they were hard, calculating, and dangerous. "We just want to take the young lady home where she belongs," he said in a low voice that only Sarah could hear. "There's no need to involve anyone else in this situation." Sarah glanced around the busy emergency room. Dr. Martinez was treating a patient 3 beds away, completely unaware of what was happening. Nurse Rodriguez was updating charts at the far end of the room. The other patients and families were focused on their own medical emergencies. No one was paying attention to the conversation happening at the nurse's station. "She said her name is Emma Rodriguez, not Elizabeth Thornfield," Sarah whispered back, trying to keep her voice steady. "And she's clearly afraid of you." The shorter guard had moved closer during their conversation, positioning himself between Sarah and the rest of the emergency room. Together, the two men created a barrier that blocked anyone else from seeing Sarah's distressed expression. "The girl hit her head quite hard," the shorter man said smoothly. "Head injuries can cause confusion, memory problems, even false memories. Surely as a medical professional, you understand this." Sarah knew they were right about head injuries causing confusion, but everything about this situation felt wrong. The girl's fear seemed genuine, not the disorientation of someone with a brain injury, and the way these men were behaving, blocking her from calling security, told her everything she needed to know. "I still need to follow hospital protocol," Sarah said, reaching for the phone again. This time, the shorter guard stepped forward and gently but firmly pushed the phone back into its cradle. "Doctor, let me be very clear," he said quietly. "We have important people who are very worried about Lady Elizabeth, people who would be very unhappy if this situation became complicated." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah realized she was dealing with criminals who had been planning this carefully. The fake uniforms, the official story about a palace, even the fake name, it was all designed to make their victim's disappearance look legitimate. From the hospital bed, Emma called out weakly, "Dr. Chen, are you okay?" Sarah noticed that Emma had remembered her name from earlier. That was a good sign that her mental faculties were intact. despite what the men claimed about confusion from the head injury. "I'm fine, Emma," Sarah called back, deliberately using the name the girl had given her rather than the false identity the men had provided. The tall guard's jaw tightened when he heard Sarah use Emma's real name. "Her name is Elizabeth," he corrected sharply, his polite facade beginning to crack. "Actually, let me check something," Sarah said, thinking quickly. "I need to run some tests to make sure there's no serious brain damage. Standard procedure for head injuries." She walked back to Emma's bedside, with both guards following closely behind her. "Emma, I need to ask you some basic questions to check your mental status." "What year is it?" Emma looked directly at Sarah, understanding immediately what she was trying to do. "It's 2024, she answered clearly. "What city are we in?" "Chicago, Illinois." "What's your full name and age?" "Emma Maria Rodriguez. I'm 17 years old. I live at 2847 Oak Street with my mother, Carmen Rodriguez. She works at the textile factory on 5th Avenue. Emma's voice grew stronger with each answer. "I was walking home from my job at the grocery store 6 weeks ago, when these two men grabbed me from behind and put something over my face that made me pass out." The guards stepped forward quickly. "She's clearly delusional," the tall one announced loudly enough for nearby staff to hear. The head injury has caused severe confusion, but Sarah was now convinced that Emma was telling the truth. Her answers were too detailed and specific to be the random confabulations of someone with a brain injury. A confused patient might get basic facts wrong, but they wouldn't create such an elaborate and consistent false narrative about being kidnapped. "Where have they been keeping you, Emma?" Sarah asked, continuing her examination while appearing to check Emma's pupils with a small flashlight. "Some kind of old building outside the city. It looked like it might have been a mansion once, but it was run down. There were bars on the windows of the room where they kept me locked up." Emma spoke quickly, as if she knew her time to explain was limited. "There were other girls there too, but I never saw them clearly. I heard voices sometimes through the walls." Sarah's stomach lurched. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping. If there were other girls, this could be part of something much larger and more horrible. The shorter guard moved to the head of Emma's bed. "I think we've heard enough of these fantasies. Lady Elizabeth needs to come with us now for proper care at our private medical facility." "Wait," Sarah said firmly. "I haven't finished my examination, and hospital policy requires that all patients with head injuries be monitored for at least 6 hours to watch for signs of brain swelling or other complications. We don't have time for lengthy hospital stays," the tall guard replied. "Our physicians are waiting to take over her care." Sarah knew she was running out of options. These men were determined to take Emma away, and she didn't have the authority to stop them legally. But she also knew that if Emma left with them, she might never be seen again. "Let me just finish documenting her injuries for the medical record," Sarah said, picking up Emma's chart and moving toward the computer station. "It will only take a few minutes." As she sat down at the computer, she quickly opened a new screen and began typing, but not a medical report. Instead, she started composing an urgent message to hospital security. "Emergency, in ER bed 7. Patient claims to be kidnapping victim. 2 men in fake uniforms attempting to remove her against her will. Need immediate assistance." The shorter guard had moved behind her and was reading over her shoulder. "That's not a medical report, doctor," he said coldly. Sarah's finger hovered over the send button. "I'm just making notes about her case," she said, trying to sound casual. "Delete it," the guard ordered. "Now." Sarah looked back at Emma, who was watching the interaction with growing panic in her eyes. She looked around the emergency room again, desperately hoping someone would notice what was happening. But everyone was still busy with their own patients and tasks. Then she saw something that gave her hope. Dr. Martinez was walking toward their section of the emergency room, probably to check on the progress with the new patient. If she could get his attention somehow, maybe she could get help. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah called out, perhaps a bit too loudly. "Could you take a look at this patient? I'm concerned about some of her symptoms." The tall guard immediately stepped forward to intercept Dr. Martinez. "Thank you, but we're taking Lady Elizabeth to our private facility now. She doesn't require any additional care here." Dr. Martinez looked confused. "I thought you said she had a serious head injury. Those really should be monitored closely for several hours. Our facility is fully equipped to handle her needs," the shorter guard insisted. But Dr. Martinez was an experienced emergency physician, and he could sense when something wasn't right. "Actually, Let me just take a quick look at her chart and examination results before anyone leaves. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Dr. Martinez was her senior and carried more authority than she did. If anyone could find a way to keep Emma safe, it would be him. Emma seemed to sense the same thing. "Doctor," she called out to Dr. Martinez, "I need to tell you something important. These men are not who they say they are." Dr. Martinez stopped in his tracks and looked directly at Emma. Years of emergency medicine had taught him to recognize genuine fear, and what he saw in this young girl's eyes was unmistakable terror. He walked closer to her bed, ignoring the two guards who tried to position themselves between him and Emma. "What do you need to tell me?" Dr. Martinez asked gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had handled countless crisis situations. "My name is Emma Rodriguez, not Elizabeth Thornfield," Emma said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "These men kidnapped me 6 weeks ago. They've been holding me prisoner, and there are other girls too. Please don't let them take me back." The tall guard stepped forward immediately. "Dr. Martinez, this young lady has suffered a severe concussion. She's experiencing post-traumatic amnesia and confabulation, which are common symptoms after brain injuries. We understand this is concerning, but we have proper medical documentation and authorization to transport her to our specialized facility." Dr. Martinez had been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years. He had seen real cases of post-traumatic amnesia, and he had also seen enough victims of violence to recognize the difference. Emma's story was too detailed and consistent to be confabulation. Moreover, something about these guards bothered him. Their uniforms were impressive, but they looked more like theatrical costumes than actual military dress. "I'd like to see this documentation and authorization, Doctor," Martinez said firmly. The shorter guard reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking folder. "Here are all the necessary papers," he said, handing them over. Dr. Martinez examined the documents. They looked professional at first glance, with official seals and signatures. But as he read more carefully, he noticed several inconsistencies. The letter had mentioned a medical facility he had never heard of, despite knowing most private hospitals in the region. The signature was illegible, and the authorization number format didn't match any system he was familiar with. "These documents appear to be fraudulent," Dr. Martinez announced loudly enough for the entire emergency room to hear. The atmosphere changed instantly. Several nurses looked up from their work, and the security guard who was always stationed near the emergency room entrance began walking toward them. "I assure you, everything is in order," the tall guard said, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "Hospital security to emergency room bed 7 immediately." Dr. Martinez spoke into the communication system. "We have a potential security situation." Emma let out a sob of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought no one would believe me." The two fake guards realized their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The tall one made a move toward Emma's bed, but Dr. Martinez stepped between them. "You need to step away from the patient," he ordered. "Now. You don't understand the consequences of interfering with our mission," the shorter guard said, his polite facade completely gone now. "There are important people who will be very unhappy about this delay." Within moments, 2 hospital security officers arrived, followed by a Chicago police officer who had been completing paperwork in the hospital's administrative office after bringing in an earlier patient. "Officers, these 2 men brought in a patient claiming she was injured in an accident," Dr. Martinez explained quickly. "But the patient says they kidnapped her and have been holding her against her will. The documentation they provided appears to be fake." Officer Johnson, a veteran cop who had worked this area for 15 years, immediately assessed the situation. He had dealt with human trafficking cases before and knew the signs. "Gentlemen, I need to see some identification," he said to the guards. The tall guard reached slowly into his jacket, but instead of pulling out identification, he grabbed Emma's arm and yanked her toward the edge of the bed. "We're leaving now," he declared. "Stop right there," Officer Johnson shouted, drawing his weapon. "Release the girl and put your hands where I can see them." The shorter guard panicked and ran toward the emergency room exit. Officer Johnson spoke quickly into his radio, calling for backup and describing the fleeing suspect. The tall guard still held Emma's arm, but he was now surrounded by hospital security and faced with a police officer's drawn weapon. "Let her go," Officer Johnson commanded. "There's nowhere to run." Finally, the tall guard released Emma and raised his hands. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said. trying to regain his composure. "We have legal custody of this girl. We'll let the courts figure that out," Officer Johnson replied, moving forward with handcuffs. As the fake guard was being arrested, Emma began telling her story to Officer Johnson, while Dr. Martinez continued monitoring her medical condition. She described the house where she had been held, provided details about the other girls she had heard, and gave descriptions of several other people she had seen during her captivity. "Emma, you mentioned other girls," Officer Johnson said gently. "This is very important. Can you tell me anything about where this house is located?" Emma closed her eyes, trying to remember details from the few times she had been moved between rooms. "We drove for about an hour to get here, mostly on a highway. When we first arrived at the hospital, I could see we were downtown, so the house must be outside the city. It was big and old, with stone walls. There was a tall metal fence around the property." Sarah, who had been quietly documenting everything, spoke up. "Officer." She also mentioned seeing other girls and hearing voices. "This could be a larger operation." Officer Johnson nodded grimly. Human trafficking rings were among the most serious crimes he dealt with, and they often involved multiple victims and complex criminal networks. "Emma, you're safe now," he assured her. "We're going to need you to give a detailed statement, but first, let's make sure you get the medical care you need." Dr. Martinez completed his examination and determined that while Emma had sustained a concussion and some bruises, her injuries were not life-threatening. However, he recommended keeping her in the hospital overnight for observation, both for medical reasons and for her safety. As Officer Johnson was completing the arrest of the tall guard, his radio crackled with news that the shorter guard had been apprehended in the hospital parking lot while trying to start a car. "Emma," Officer Johnson said, "we're going to form a task force to investigate this case. Your information could help us rescue the other girls and shut down this operation. Are you willing to help us?" Emma nodded without hesitation. "Yes. If I can help save those other girls, I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah felt proud of the way everyone in the hospital had come together to protect Emma. It reminded her why she became a doctor in the first place, to help people who couldn't help themselves. Over the next few hours, Emma worked with police sketch artists to create descriptions of the other criminals involved. She provided details about the layout of the house, the schedule of when guards were present, and everything else she could remember. Within 48 hours, police had located the property Emma described and rescued 6 other girls who had been held captive. The criminal network was larger than initially suspected, involving fake documents, human trafficking, and connections to organized crime in 3 different states. Dr. Martinez later learned that Emma's mother, Carmen Rodriguez, had been desperately searching for her daughter for 6 weeks. She had filed missing person reports and had been working with community organizations to publicize Emma's disappearance. The reunion between Emma and her mother in the hospital room brought tears to the eyes of everyone who witnessed it. The 2 fake guards were eventually sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and their cooperation with authorities led to the arrest of 12 other people involved in the trafficking operation. Sarah often thought about how differently things could have ended if Emma hadn't been brave enough to speak up, or if Dr. Martinez hadn't trusted his instincts about the suspicious situation. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important part of being a healthcare provider wasn't just treating medical conditions, but being alert to signs that patients might need protection, as well as healing. Emma made a full physical recovery from her injuries, but the psychological healing took much longer. She worked with counselors specializing in trauma recovery and eventually became an advocate for other trafficking victims. Her courage in speaking up that night in the emergency room had not only saved her own life, but it also led to the rescue of 6 other girls and the dismantling of a criminal network that had been operating for years. The hospital implemented new training for staff to help them recognize potential signs of human trafficking, and Sarah often shared Emma's story as an example of why healthcare workers needed to trust their instincts when something seemed wrong, even in seemingly routine situations.